As David indicated, for the first panel, I'm the moderator, and Simon, Madison, and Murray are the panelists. I will not be interviewing the panelists. Rather, the panelists will be leading a discussion for the entire room. We didn't ask them to come prepared with questions or anything like that, because some of it needs to be organic, we're hoping, to come out of all the stuff that we've been hearing. There have been multiple times when we seem to be saying very similar things. And then there's times when we're not saying the same thing at all. Or as Simon said to us right beforehand, you Americans are always so polite. Thank you so much for that paper. And so I think he's wanting to mix it up a little bit. Hopefully it won't go all the way to the point where it spills over into the Lamb and Scroll and into a food fight like Steve showed us. So a panelist may bring a question to the table to start the discussion, or someone else in the room may wish to toss out the first grenade. As appropriate metaphor there. As the moderator of the discussion, I will not use the metaphor of herding cats or collecting butterflies, but I will be trying to referee the discussion a bit so that it doesn't just turn into a two-person discussion. So with that dubious and questionable introduction to the panel, let's just get started. Would someone like to begin?
I'm happy to throw a thesis out there and see where it goes. We've talked a bit about apostolicity and whether or not that matters. It was raised again just in the last paper. So I'll throw a thesis out there that the apostolicity of every one of the New Testament documents matters. And that if they're not apostolic, then we've got some serious issues with our understanding of canon. I'm trying to create the controversy that Simon was aiming for.
And you by apostolic, you mean apostolic in the broad sense of, in Tertullian's language, apostoli and apostoliki.
Exactly. Yes, so that's the distinction we talked about this morning.
Yeah.
Tertullian, in talking about the Gospels, talks about the two Gospels by apostles. He says Matthew and John. A lot of people are going to dispute Matthew especially, but also John. But that's how Tertullian puts it. And then he says, and two by apostolic men, apostoliki.
Yeah.
And Mark and Luke.
Yeah. I thought Lee was a bit down on the apostoliki, actually. I thought you were a bit you were a bit negative on Tertullian's view of Mark and Luke, because what Tertullian says, if I remember right, is that the apostles Matthew and John establish the faith, and Mark and Luke renew the faith, and that I think part that order is sort of reflected probably in Tertullian's New Testament, where you have the Latin order of Matthew, John, Luke, and Mark.
Yeah, well, the context for that was his criticism of Marcion for using Luke and not Matthew and John, and then he mentions because apostles, instead of those who were apostolic, or they were in that being mentored by the apostles, and he preferred Matthew and John over Mark and Luke.
Yeah, but he's still positive about.
Oh yeah, he didn't reject them, but he did prioritize them. I think in that context. Yeah. And so Matthew and John were for Tertullian at a higher plane than Mark and Luke.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
But also I think that'll support my thesis that there's a premium being placed on apostolicity.
Yeah.
Which is not just it's different from antiquity. I'd say it's not just that it's old. It's different from eyewitness or some kind of connection to Jesus. It's a commissioning or an office. That it matters that these authoritative texts come from, in some way, in the broader sense, from those who Jesus commissioned to bear testimony to him.
Did you limit that definition to the New Testament?
Yes.
Okay. So how does this relate to criteria for Hebrew Bible?
Yeah, I think it's going to be slightly different. And yeah, we'll have to think about that. But this is a New Testament conference. So.
Madison, that wasn't the question I expected you to be asking. I thought you'd ask, well, what about Hebrews?
Oh, I don't care about that anymore.
Oh, Dan.
Yeah, my question is your category of apostolic, as you've defined it, would that be applicable to a pseudonymous writing?
Yeah, so that's a great question that's bubbling under the surface for us. And my tendency would be to say no. Maybe you could make a case, I think somebody was saying this earlier, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten who was making the argument, that if you've got somebody on Peter, if Peter commissions somebody, or you've got somebody in a Petrine school or a disciple of Peter or something like that, who's writing in Peter's name and really delivering Peter's message, even though it's not Peter, then maybe that kind of pseudonymity could fly under my category.
Like Mark?
Like Mark
If Mark is writing the memoirs of Peter, what? And I'm playing devil because I think I agree with you a lot more than what I'm saying.
Yeah.
If Mark can write the memoirs of Peter and fall under that category, why can't Deutero-Peter write 2nd Peter?
Yeah, I think there's a difference because Deutero-Peter is claiming Peter's name, is using Peter's name.
Okay.
Right, it's not kata Petru.
That's right, exactly. Whereas the Peter-Mark connection in relation to the gospel is not making a claim to authorship. It's formally anonymous, even if it's received and recognised as being from Mark early on, as Simon will say. There's no strong attribution in the text of the gospel, and so there's no authorial claim that's claiming Peter here in a way that Peter's name is being used in 2 Peter.
What about then when we have internal authoritative discrepancy? So John 21, which is relatively clearly not apostolic. It refers post hoc to the beloved disciple's death, if we're taking the beloved disciple as the nominal author of the 4th gospel, and therefore the authentication mechanism for the gospel itself. John 21 as a colophon is in and of itself antithetical to that. Do we say then that similarly the pericope adulterae, does it fall into that same category where it is of another hand and perhaps not apostolic? What do we do with internal consistency in our canon? Do we receive the whole gospel because it's ascribed to it, or do we just receive that part which is up to John 20 and leave 21 off, especially given the discrepancy with Peter? Peter's left off in 20 as an almost castaway within the community, and is only rehabilitated in 21.
Yes, so I think the pericope adulterae is easier.
Yeah, that's
because of the textual situation. I think it's clearer, at least in my view, and I think probably a majority view, that it's not originally part of the gospel. So that it's come into the gospel along the way. Whereas I'm not convinced that John 21 is a colophon or is a later addition. I think you can read it as an original part of the gospel composition. It comes down to how you read the we, doesn't it? In 21, wherever it is, 21, 24, we know his testimony is true. Is that an authorial we? He switches back to the first person in the next verse. And it's, Kostenberger at least advocates reading it that way. So you need to convince me at least.
we don't have any evidence for John circulating without John 21. Do we?
Actually, the P66 has about an inch and a half break after chapter 20.
Yeah, sure. There are. Yeah, I know that. Yeah.
So there's a distinction there. However, that happened.
It's still got 21.
Are there negative criteria? So Clement has a connection. We have others within the early church who are writing who are adjacent or like downstream from apostles. I mean, John does have a clear kind of lineage. And so what's the additional criteria that creates the boundaries?
I think there need to be additional criteria. So I think the criteria we've been talking about of orthodoxy and Catholicity are also in the mix. Yes. So my thesis is not it's really just for the purpose of creating a bit of controversy here.
Well, I to take the bait.
Yeah, but I wouldn't want to put it as an exclusive criterion. It's it goes together with the others.
Where does that give us with the book of Revelation? Do you have to claim it's associated with John the Apostle to regard it as canonical? Or can it be another John? And how is it apostolic in that sense?
Yeah, so that's a great question because it takes us to the definition of apostle, doesn't it? And Paul is the good case study because he's an unusual apostle. He's untimely born, as he says in 1 Corinthians 15:8. But there's something about direct commissioning from the Lord. I think that's a key criterion. And that's how Paul can sneak in, even though he's not an eyewitness from the first. That's the criterion in Acts 1. Paul's not an eyewitness from the first, but he sneaks in because he's a witness of the resurrection through the Damascus Road, and then he's specifically commissioned. And so the specific commissioning. So maybe you could say, I mean, my view is that I'm hopelessly conservative on all of these things. So my view is that John is from the apostle, but maybe you could say, if it is by another John, then he comes under the category of apostolicity because he receives the commission to write to the 7 churches in the initial vision commission, similar to how Paul receives his commission in a vision commission. So maybe you could expand it that way.
If it is John the Apostle, his grammar's fallen apart.
Yes, or maybe he's writing in a completely different genre. Which will explain the stylistic differences.
Or he needed a better secretary. Michael, I think you had a...
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm playing devil's advocate here with this, but we've heard a lot about the criteria, and you bring up it has to be apostolic in some sense. Why in the 21st century are we bound to the early church's criteria?
Yeah, and I think that's another question lurking in this discussion. I'd again want to be a bit more theological about it. The canon discussion often merges into a historical descriptive kind of mode. Here's the criteria that we think the early church was using. Now, of course, none of the early Christian writers lay out those criteria. You don't get it from any of them. Here are our 3 criteria. Even though those criteria are a construct that we've put together in reading the early church, this seems to be the kind of reasoning that they were engaging with in order to recognise what was canonical. But if we focus on that historical process, then we do end up with the mess, right? And the historical process is a mess. But if we're a little bit more theological about it, then we say, isn't the idea of canon the idea that God has given his word and the church is then recognising it and receiving it? Somebody mentioned Metzger earlier, and there's a helpful quote from him in his canon book that says we've got to distinguish between the fundamental idea of canonicity and the drawing up of canon lists. And the fundamental idea of canonicity is going to revolve around inspiration or God-givenness. And so in theory, if that's right, and that's a common Christian conviction, if that's right, then the canon exists before it's recognised. And it can deal with all sorts of mess in the process of its recognition because it's there from a divine point of view even before the church recognises and receives it. And the church being the church is going to have problems recognising and receiving it. So that we can... But if we make that theology versus history distinction, I find that quite helpful. And so then we're not so much using... I wouldn't say we're bound by early church criteria, but we're trying to do the same thing the early church did, which is recognise what God has given.
There was a helpful phrase earlier about it's not canon formation, but canon recognition. It shows up with my students. They'll say, well, what if we found Paul's letter to the Laodiceans? What do we do then? And I always say, well, first find it. But here's where they lose interest. I say, well, then if churches worldwide recognize it as useful for their faith, for several hundred years, then we ought to open up the discussion. Well, they're no longer interested. They wanted to vote next week. And so I think that's part of this issue too, is that we want something that we could apply next week rather than allowing that the discussion might involve churches in Africa and Asia for several hundred years, and then we sort of lose interest. Yes, sir.
It seems like an important issue, and this issue seems to be under the surface, or sometimes it's bubbling up, but how accepted was pseudonymity? That seems like a really important question, because if pseudonymity, I mean, we've had different approaches here, that it is accepted, that there's exceptions maybe, that it, right? If it is accepted, then it seems like what you could recognize as apostolic grows, right? If it's accepted and it's normal, then you could understand that a Pauline school produces the pastorals, and they are connected to Paul, and so they're apostolic. So, could you discuss that?
Sure.
Go ahead, Simon.
Well, that's the thing is, it's quite hard to generalise about that, because in the Greco-Roman world, I mean, which I'm more familiar with than the Jewish literature. In the Greco-Roman world, at the time of, at the time people were sort of talking about the canon, people were also talking about canons of Plato, and there was there was discussion about which works Plato really wrote, and the pseudonymous ones were, in Diogenes Laertius, for example, he says, these are written by Plato, those he didn't write are nothoi, bastards, in the sort of old-fashioned sense. Whereas on the other hand, some Pythagoreans did clearly write things in the name of Pythagoras, and so the difficulty is it's quite hard to generalise about. In the Greco-Roman world, pseudonymity was acceptable, or it was unacceptable.
So but from that, could we say for some it was acceptable, some was not acceptable, and then we could fit? Does that make sense? I mean, if we said, well, some thought it was acceptable, and if some thought it was acceptable, then certainly some in the church might have thought it was acceptable, and thus we could have.
Yeah, but then we need then to talk about chronology and social contexts, about where and when it might have been acceptable and not. So,
yeah, and I think we're assuming that we all mean the same thing by that word, and we're talking about texts that have a name applying to them that's not the author's name. Right. But I think there's a difference between texts that are intentionally passed off as texts of another, and then texts that are written at like speech and character exercises or something like that, where they kind of take on the persona of a character and write in that name. And I think arguably something like the Enochic literature would kind of fit there. Like I really don't, it doesn't appear to be the case, though please correct me, that anyone really thought this was son of Adam that's writing this text. So I think that's another kind of wrench, but I don't know that I have anything beyond that, but to say that I think a presentation of an implied author other than the historical author is one thing, and trying to trick people is another.
Chris, what does that get us then back to expanding our categories of what is then useful? So to use Steve Runge's category of edification. So additions to the book of Daniel, fairly clearly, from the quite considerable time span between when Daniel was ostensibly set and when Bel and the Dragon is then composed and added to it, Daniel is not alive. But it seems to be edifying for the church, for the synagogues and the congregations in Alexandria, where it spread fairly widely. And yet that is set as if it is Daniel writing, etc., etc. And so do we end up not having to move on from this category of
I'm with you, Chris.
Apostolicity, thank you. it's jet lag too. And then we start expanding that category.
And this is arguably the case for like the Psalter as well, and some of our other canonical texts, at least from my perspective, and I know there would be disagreements among us on that, but yeah, it's writing, in the character of David, or appealing to the life of David to express these various sentiments, or Moses, or
hang on,
Korah.
Dan, I think Dan had us.
Yeah, this
Just very, very briefly, I don't think though that edification alone ever becomes a sort of defining. I mean, just like apostolicity doesn't function kind of as the sole criterion.
Yeah,
I mean, which is why in the early church you get what Athanasius calls the canonical texts and the church the ecclesiastical texts, which are like in the 39 articles. There's the Bible, and then there are other there are the Apocrypha, which are edifying, which only fulfill that criterion, but not the criteria that others are interested.
For instruction of life and manners. That's the phrase, isn't it?
Yeah, this is a question that falls under the category of I like to hear smarter people than myself talk about things I don't understand. But it's both historical and theological, and that is, we've talked a lot about criteria of canonicity. We've not talked at all about occasion of canonicity. What are the historical circumstances that gave rise to the perceived need to prioritize some texts over other texts, and does that have a bearing, and if so, how, on the discussion of pseudepigraphy?
If some of you are confused, there were some breakout sessions that did talk about it, but we can't attend all of them. So someone who did talk about it may want to bring that topic back up. Thoroughly intimidated.
Or not. Well, David Brackley is probably the person who's written most on this in early Christianity, not so much on the question of pseudonymity, but on the social situations in which canons are articulated. And I mean, I think part of the sort of positive dimension of the messiness point is that we're not just relying on what one council once said. Mm-hmm. That it's something that emerges from a great diversity of different voices in the church.
Yeah, and sorry, you go.
Yeah, please, Murray.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go for it.
I was just going to say, I agree that I think that the origins are much more organic than maybe we've given or the impression that we've given at various points. That it does appear to be the case that there are local adjudications about the canon, and then that kind of coalesces. I'd love to hear what Murray has to say, but then maybe I'll have a follow-up or question or something on that.
Sure. Yes, I agree. It's a messy process. At the same time, talk about the Gospels for a minute, and I'm sure Simon's got more to add than I can add here. There does seem to be, to me, I think you can make a good case for the early emergence of the four gospel canon, or the early recognition of the four gospel canon, which is, to your point, Dan, it's made more explicit and it's solidified, or I don't know what the right phrase is, after Marcion, because that raises the controversy, and the church has to react to the controversy. Here's a very different view than what we've been entertaining up until this point. He's the Pontic mouse who gnawed the gospel to pieces. That's Tertullian's phrase. And so we've got to respond to that. And so that draws from... And so that's why in Tertullian and in Irenaeus you get these really explicit four gospels. And even, to my mind, far-fetched with Irenaeus, there's got to be four gospels because there's four corners of the earth and there's four winds.
Irenaeus and Jerome. And, yeah.
So that's what draws the more explicit, but I think you can argue way before Marcion there's four Gospels because they emerge from four apostolic missions. And so from the beginning the church is recognising and receiving four Gospels. You can point to little pockets where there's some controversy, like the Gospel of Peter gets accepted by one bishop, but there's a four Gospel canon that's pretty clear from very early on, but that's not explicit until you get the controversy.
Oh,
Yeah, thank you. So contextually, criteria for canonization developed dialectically. So Marcion's canon's too small, Montanus and others' canon's too large, and so it's out of those dialogues that criteria developed. Let me push back, though, on a modern term, deuteroism, Deutero-Pauline. Now, let me be a hard-nosed critic here. Has Deutero-Paulinism or Deutero-Petrinism been established? Do we know that there's a different author of 2 Peter? If so, who is it? And is that person superior than Peter? Show me. I want to know. If you don't know, you can't claim it. Likewise, the Paulines. If Colossians, Ephesians, Philemon are written to the Lycus Valley, Anatolia, how else would you write to churches there? But to, talk about, syncretism and those kinds of things. If Paul is contextual in writing to Philippians, why not contextual in writing to the Lycus Valley? And we have a conversation behind the barn with a couple of pastoral leaders. Well, you're going to say stuff you might not say to a group, okay? So show me you know that Paul didn't write that. Show me you know that. If you don't know it, you can't claim it. So I challenge Deuteranism.
how was that, Simon?
I'm happy to believe in it. Show me you know that. You don't know that. You can't claim it. Now, call him questioned, fine. But I don't think Deuteranism has been established critically. Tell me I'm wrong.
I once reviewed a commentary on Ephesians. I can't remember who it was by. It's a German commentary on Ephesians, which claimed that Ephesians, because it was dependent on Colossians, which was Deutero-Pauline, that Ephesians was therefore Trito-Pauline.
So let me posit a question. I don't know if it was Steve who asked this, but said the apostolicity as a criterion came up because Gospels like the Gospel of Peter started claiming apostolic authority. So the question is that why they started claiming apostolic authority? In other words, if you're going to write it's a chicken and egg question. Which came first? Was it that they were already discussing the value of these coming from an apostle, and therefore if I'm going to posit a fictional gospel, I'm going to have it come from the gospel have it come from Peter rather than the Ebionites or the Nazarenes or someone like that?
I'd say, again, it's the implicit explicit thing. That's how I'd explain it. That they start talking about it as a criterion after there's controversy, but it's there implicitly from the beginning. And I think you can show that each of the Gospels, this is my paper this morning, so sorry to those who are there, each of the Gospels already implicitly makes a claim that it's apostolic in the sense that I've defined. Mm-hmm. Now, Luke appeals to the eyewitnesses and servants of the word. John has the beloved disciple. Mark has the connection with Peter. Matthew is the most complicated, but I think you can show that he develops this chain of authority: God, Christ, apostles, written gospel. He's got twice this phrase, this gospel of the kingdom, or this gospel would be proclaimed, in context where there's no antecedent referent for the gospel, and it seems he's talking about his own written work. And so there's a claim to apostolicity in all the gospels. You can make similar claims even, say, with Hebrews, right? So attested to us by those who heard him. There's an implicit connection to the apostles' claim being made already in the texts themselves. And then the church starts highlighting that and drawing attention to that after there's competition from, say, a Gospel of Peter or Thomas.
Sorry, I missed your paper. Sorry, I'll be quick, Adam. In Mark, what is the internal claim?
Great question. The internal claim is, so this is Richard Balcom, I'm just downloading him. He calls it the inclusio of eyewitness testimony. Oh, that's right. Peter's mentioned first and last in the narrative, and in ways that seem to highlight him. So in 1:16, you've got, he calls Simon and Andrew Simon's brother, so you get Peter's name mentioned twice. And he's the first name mentioned in the narrative, apart from John the Baptist, who's dead by the time the Gospel's being written. So he's the first living person mentioned in the Gospel. And then at the end, the angel says, go and tell his disciples and Peter. Whereas Peter's highlighted as ahead of the disciples everywhere else, but now he's last, and so his name's highlighted. Balcom draws attention to parallels and says this is a historiographical convention of drawing attention to your primary source. and this is Mark drawing attention to his primary source. And then that fits with the early church tradition from Papias on, right? Mark being Peter's interpreter. Yeah.
Thanks, Mike.
Chad.
I had a question. A lot of our discussion revolves around criteria for canonicity or retrospective criteria for recognition. But do you think it would be helpful, and we've kind of touched on this as well, but alongside the criteria for recognition or canonicity, to talk about the catalyst for canon? So the external catalysts that we've kind of been talking about mostly are 4th century canon list making, heretical controversy, persecution, things of that nature. But if we also allow the category not only for external catalysts but internal catalysts within the community, what do you think that would do for our account of canon formation or the dissemination of scriptural writings? So David Mead and Brevard Childs picks up this idea of asking, was the canon primarily pulled by external factors, or was there something internal that pushed it? So some of the major options of people thinking along these lines that were given is, one, the concept of canon being in the air by the antecedent authority of the Hebrew Scriptures. So if there was a Hebrew Bible or a Hebrew set of Scriptures, that the church was then never without a canon, in the sense that they had an Old Testament canon, which was their New Testament, in the sense of the proclamation of the kerygma according to the Scriptures. So the antecedent authority and stability of a Hebrew canon, whatever that might look like. 2, the natural response to revelatory words. So thinking about the Old Testament period, the exile and the Exodus are the major events that spark a lot of the narration and interpretation of Israel's history. And then finally, just this idea of not only defense against heresy, but discipleship in the faith. So like the Great Commission spawning this idea of baptize them, make disciples by teaching them all the words that I've spoken, and then seeing the Gospel of Matthew, the compositional work that Matthew has done is what is required for the fulfillment of the Great Commission. Large blocks of discourse interpreted by a narrative portrayal. So just thinking about those categories, what are your thoughts on the way that might inform or reshape some of the ways that we think of catalysts for canon, if there are some internal factors that might push the formation of a group of literature, Gospels, Paul, and then in early century, 2nd, 3rd century, becoming a way of talking about where might this criteria or plausibility structure come from for when we get into the 4th century. But that's just kind of a thought, just to throw against the wall.
I don't have well-formed thoughts, so I'll start first and we'll complete it from this. In my understanding, I want to use the language of kind of it being organic in a sense, because there are communities that receive these texts first, and then presumably they pass them on. And so they pass them on because they think they're helpful. And then there starts to be conversations among the bishops and other leaders about whether their judgment about their helpfulness is indeed true, and then some disputes about that. And so I would take that to be these kind of early steps, and that would be the best I could say, Chad, about the internal stuff, but I'll defer at this point.
I think it's a great point. I think it's an important point to recognise, and I mean I think part of it is the question of necessity, isn't it? What do we read out in church? What do we preach on? And so there are judgments being made internally which aren't sort of conditioned by sort of what heretics might be saying. I mean, also Mike Kruger's done some good work on sort of the fact that with the new what you expect with a covenant is covenant documents, and since we are in a new we're in a new covenant, we've got the old covenant documents, and even as far back as Paul almost refers to the Paleia Theake as it's almost equating the law and the old covenant. But irrespective of the terminology, a lot of the talk about the gospel is in covenantal terms, and so one might expect covenant documents to come with that.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point, and just to pick up on both of them, you can maybe push it even a little bit further and tie it into apostolicity, since that's the thesis I'm driving here. In that, if you look at the Hebrew Bible Old Testament antecedent, what you get is this, especially at the core of the Old Testament canon, the Pentateuch, you get this great act of redemption, which is then leads to a covenant, and then the covenant is accompanied by documents which record the great act of redemption and lay out the terms of the Lord's relationship with Israel. And it's the Lord himself who commands Moses, write this down. You get that several times in the law. Write this down. And Moses has a writing ministry, which is writing up the book of the covenant. And so then on that kind of model, you come across to the Gospels and you have a great act of redemption, a kind of new Exodus. That's very strong, that theme in Mark, as Rick Watts has shown. A new Exodus, a new act of redemption, and then you get to the climax of the Gospel and Jesus is talking about a new covenant. And he's in the place of the Lord, and he commissions these witnesses. And so there's an expectation that, they're going to write this down. There needs to be a covenant book that goes along with this.
So you need a scribe of the kingdom.
You need a scribe of the kingdom. That's right. Yep.
Does that go theologically with the nature of the God revealed in the Hebrew Bible is the kind of God who'd make sure that there was a record of what he'd done? Now that's a theological argument rather than a historical argument. But I think there's something to that.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. Along those lines, and this isn't necessarily a well-formed thought, but Steve Runge, your paper in bringing the sort of Enlightenment catalyst for some of these conversations brought to mind Charles Taylor, and for those that are familiar with him, this concept of like disenchantment that we have in the Western world, where pre-Enlightenment, folks are much more open to realizing that there are influences outside of their control that sort of govern daily life. And post-Enlightenment, we tend to be more closed off. And I keep having this thought as we're having this conversation. As Christian scholars, like, where is our place to talk about the role of the Spirit, right, in the production of the canon? That this isn't simply a result of historical things necessarily that we can uncover. And there maybe isn't an academic argument that can formulate that well, but I think should be something maybe we're not overly hesitant to bring into the discussion. So just any thoughts along those lines?
One of the things in response to the canon context, when that begins to be an issue, it was argued long ago, starting with Harnack, that Marcion came up with a canon and everybody said, no, not that one, here's a better one. That has no historical evidence to support it, but it was very popular, and even wonderful. Metzger promoted that. The canon that was found in the 2nd century was the canon of faith, the essence of the core beliefs that gave rise to the responses to Marcion, not a canon of books. You start saying canon consciousness is not all of a sudden everybody thought it. This went on for centuries, and you see as late as the 8th, 9th century, they're still debating which books are in and which are out. You do see after the Council of Nicaea, which didn't discuss any books whatsoever, after the identity of Jesus is established, shortly thereafter you start seeing lists. Earlier in the 3rd century, Origen has some, but he still preferred other books than what you find in the Tanakh. But having said that, while one group of churches thought we ought to read these books only, there were others that said, no, we're going to do this. And then there's some centuries after that that are still in variation. So you don't have a canon consciousness that comes all at the same time with all of the churches. That just didn't happen. So canon consciousness varied within the Christian community, and the writings which informed the faith of the church overlapped considerably, but never completely. And that's still true to this day among Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox, and Ethiopians.
So what you mean is that don't you mean that there was a canon consciousness, but there were lots of different canon consciousnesses?
What I mean is that the canon is the rule of faith. That was the canon that was obligatory in early Christianity, and the arguments were not based upon a canon of books, though some books were cited. It was based upon the faith that was transmitted in the church in its traditions.
So the statements, what we have received, we pass on, that's what that's essentially evoking.
Well, yes, to a large extent, and some of that is in a complete agreement with some of the core canons of the New Testament. The earliest canon is Romans 10:9. If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. That was right at the heart. And they begin to expand, and the canon creeds begin to expand in the 2nd century, where they're more pronounced on God as creator, and that follows after. Though God as creator is found in the New Testament, it's not in canon formation. And the God as creator and all of those kinds of things that are added to it, including the church, you don't see any references to the virgin birth for quite some period of time. I think it's in the Nicene Creed that you first begin to see that, and that would be in the 4th century. So those canons begin to develop over a period of time, and it's the canons of faith that gave rise to the biblical canons, not the other way around. We often put one over the other. And sorry.
What if we said it was a dialectic between them? Sorry, you
I'm sorry?
No. What if we said were you going to say something? What if we said it was a dialectic between them? I think I'm not sure we can prioritise one or the other. I think they go together, because where does the rule of faith come from? Romans 10:9, 1 Corinthians 15, from the apostolic documents. And so there's this dialectic that's going backwards and forwards between the rule of, how do we form our rule of faith? What is the core of the faith?
But not apostolic documents. It was the apostolic faith that was transmitted in the church before there were documents.
The document's pretty early.
Yeah.
Yes, but the faith was before Paul wrote 10:9 and 10, Romans 10:9 and 10. But that particular tradition preceded Paul and gave rise to the... Paul didn't say, hey, I'm writing the book of Romans, Timothy, add this to my canon. That didn't happen.
Sure, but as part of his, just to push back again, I'd say as part of his apostolic ministry, he's preaching, and I agree, he's preaching before he's writing, but he follows up pretty quickly. And so there's this dialectic that enters the fray very early, where the church is receiving the apostolic teaching, which solidifies into the rule of faith, and then the Apostles' Creed and so on. But that's always in conversation with the apostolic writings. You can't divorce it from the apostolic writings.
But they're not called scripture until much later. If any author thought he was writing scripture, how come none of them said it in the New Testament writings?
1 Timothy 5:18, this scripture.
The 1 Timothy 5:18 is a reference to Jesus, and it's speaking of the sayings of Jesus, and that's found in Matthew and in Luke, but they don't mention the gospel itself. The Gospels are not quoted by name until much later. It's the words of Jesus within them.
It's graphe, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a writing.
Graphe, How about 2 Peter 3:16? I mean, it is always 3:16, isn't it? but
inspired. So it's inspired.
Where 2 Peter is saying about people who twist the writings of Paul, as they do the other graphite.
Yeah.
Now, that's normally translated scriptures in most of the English translations I consulted. So is 2 Peter actually starting to establish that category by putting Paul's letters alongside the Old Testament, as we call it? I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Well, and it shows up in 1 Timothy 5 again, that same thing where you have the juxtaposition of the two.
Oh, yeah, I think that's a pattern you see across the New Testament, that the scriptures and the words that Jesus has spoken is what the disciples believe in John 2. That the prophets and the apostles in 2 Peter 3. You get this. Mike Kruger again has got an article on this. I'm trying to remember where it is, maybe in Jets a couple of years ago, that there's already in the New Testament this, he calls it a bi-covenantal canon consciousness, that the emerging apostolic writings are set alongside the ancient the received scriptures of Israel. And you get it already. So 1 Timothy 5:18 has the same kind of pattern to it. This scripture, I think it's singular, isn't it? And then you get Deuteronomy next to a word of Jesus, which is the same as what we've got in Luke 10. So, yeah.
So
you had your hand up for a long time.
Sorry. Chris.
Well, I was just going to say, if we're going to work on the canon as a rule of faith, then do we throw this a spanner into the works and say that the reception history highlights the differentiation of our canon? So the fourth gospel gets short shrift for almost 100 years after its composition on my reading of when it was composed and codified, and yet it gets short shrift because it is used in means that are incompatible with the rule of faith. Conversely, in the Eastern Church, you have significantly expanded canon because they are compatible with the rule of faith, and therefore we have the East-West split over a broad variety of things, but supported by what we choose as canonized. And they're all still considered apostolic, but what we treat as canon becomes socially salient. It's all about the social context in which the arguments are embedded. Therefore, do we actually have a canon? And can we ever say that we have a canon? Because, I mean, even just to play pure devil's advocate, we have a canon within a canon. So I was talking earlier. We have a canon within a canon now, based on what text people preach on. Some preachers will refuse to preach on
Second
Thessalonians, or Paul and Paul. That is a canon within a canon for some churches.
Yeah, Mona Hooker refused to speak at a conference on 2 Peter.
Yeah.
Because she considered it not patrine.
Yeah. So where do we draw those lines for social context of rule of faith? Alex?
I am cognizant that we're standing between a hangry mob and dinner. I would encourage us to continue the conversation on to dinner. It was very interesting, the reference to, quoting Mike, the bi-covenantal canon early in the text, your reference to Old Covenant, New Covenant, and then Steve's reference that covenant, or maybe it was you, that covenant requires documents, and then the reference to the Great Commission. I mean, those tie together in ways I have not thought of before. That's one of the things I'm going to take to dinner. Some of you have heard some things that you're going to want to ask someone about at dinner. And then some of you disagree with the whole thing and need to straighten us all out at dinner. So before we break, let's thank the panel for being